In his stirring book, Theology of Horror, Ryan Dunns tells us, quote, between 2017 and 2022, an average of 76.7 million tickets to horror movies were sold. This reflects approximately 10% of ticket sales and on average amounts to $690 million a year spent on horror films alone, close quote. In explaining his motivation to write his book, Father Dunns muses, quote, I cannot shake the feeling that those who love horror, those whose imaginations are piqued and excited by the presence of things visible and invisible, are already closet metaphysicians and theologians. For these are the moviegoers who know well the truth of Hamlet's claim, there are more things on heaven and earth, Horatio, that are dreamt up in your philosophy, close quote. Father Ryan Dunns on the deeper lessons that can be drawn from horror movies in Theology of Horror, the hidden depths of popular films now. My name is Tod Worner, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. Father Ryan Dunns is Associate Professor and Chair of the Theology Department at Marquette University. He earned his PhD in Systematic Theology from Boston College and was ordained a priest in 2015. His research explores the intersection of philosophy and theology, religion and culture, and Ignatian spirituality. He is the author of Spiritual Exercises in a Secular Age and Theology of Horror, and co-authored the forthcoming Who Will You Become? An Ignatian Introduction to Catholic Theology with Dr. Connor Kelly. In addition to his academic work, Father Dunns is a professional Irish musician teaching the tin whistle and playing the accordion for Irish dancing competitions. Father Ryan, welcome.
Tod, thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be with you this morning.
Segment 1, Why We Like a Good Scare. In addition to being a Jesuit priest and professor, Father Ryan Dunns confesses, I am a professional Irish musician, and I travel the country playing at various events. Some of the more fun and illuminating conversations I have while working on this project took place in airports and hotel bars. Harried travelers plopped down next to me, seen my reading material, and blurted out, okay, I have to ask, what are you reading? So, Father, let's begin this conversation with your answer. While sitting in those airports and hotel bars, what were you reading?
Oh, that's a great question. And as I look back on it, I was writing this book 2 years ago right now. And as I'm teaching the book this semester, I'm teaching basically week by week what I was working on 2 years ago. And I remember the research for the book was being done live. So each week I was reading up on what I would be writing the following week. So at the time, I carried under my arm an eclectic variety of books, ranging from excerpts of Joseph Conrad, Aristotle's De Anima and Metaphysics. I'd have the Summa under my arm for long stretches of time. Noel Carroll's The Philosophy of Horror, Douglas Cowan's Sacred Terror, William James, walking around with the Principles of Psychology. People thought I had like the DSM-4 with me, but it was at least William James is a little bit more poetic than the DSM. And often I had my copy of the NRSV ready to hand. Herbert McCabe, Karl Rahner, Pope Benedict, Pope Francis. I mean, I was sort of like a walking circus of theological and philosophical texts, and people would it'd catch their eye, or I would often enough like Edgar Allan Poe or Shirley Jackson or Ursula Le Guin, and I would get the cocked head and really, and that's isn't that the best way to get into a story? Yeah. Like, tell me what you're doing. And then you can engage them a bit.
So when they realize, and you're explaining, okay, you have all these theological, philosophical, psychological texts and so on, and you start to unpack that this is kind of moving towards a theology of horror, if you will. I can only imagine that just made them more intrigued. They're like, I'm going to miss my plane, but I'm not sure I want to take it. I want to sit and talk to you. First of all, are you wearing a clerical collar at this time? Are they saying there's this priest with all these books, and then we're talking about horror? Just tell me about how once they realized what you were doing, what happened in the conversation after that?
Well, there are times it completely depends. I try never to give public scandal. So if I'm sitting at a bar, it's not likely that I'm going to have a collar on if I'm traveling,
true.
or I'll pop it back. I just look very emo.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if I'm traveling in company, or if I'm traveling for obviously church related work, I do wear a collar, and that can be its own flight hazard on its own, and you want to be a bit careful because you don't want people. People react. It's the Roman collar is a Rorschach test for a lot of individuals, but once usually when I'm flying incognito, it would happen. People, I think, see it a little bit more approachable to ask us, just a fellow traveler, what is it that you're doing? And once we got to talking, I would say, well, I'm doing research on horror. Oh, why is that? Well, I teach a course on horror films. Are you a film professor? No, I'm a theologian. And then you get the head of a theologian. Are you some sort of priest? And then I would smile and say, I'm some sort of priest. That is true. And that, I would say, maybe 10 to 15% of people would say, well, I hate horror movies. All right. And then they would want to perhaps know why I would be interested. But for 80 to 85%, 90% of people, they would say things like, I grew up loving horror movies, or there's a couple of them. What's your favorite? My kids love horror movies. My spouse, my girlfriend, my boyfriend love horror movies. So it became I realized how much of a doorway into people's experiences. Yeah. And that for me, that as a priest, as a teacher, that for me was the most important thing. If you can find the doorway and get that open a little bit, that conversation will lead to dialogue and story sharing. Yeah. And ultimately, I think a conversion of mind and heart. Not necessarily right there at the table. I mean, I'm not knocking people off their horses, but you propose another framework that makes experience or theological reflection novel and maybe even more credible, because it shows that there's a risk taking involved that intrigues them.
We're going to get into this a little bit later, but just as we're on the topic right now, how much did your conversations with students, or how much did these kind of random short conversations with fellow travelers inform your writing of the book Theology of Horror?
It completely informed it. I am a real believer in Ignatian conversation, a way of entering deliberately into a relationship where stories are shared and exchanged, received reverently, and in a way that's attentive to the way God might be at work in this person's experiences and within the narrative, and listening to other people, students especially, because you almost have a captive audience to reflect with them, but people sitting at the bar, or, your flight is delayed and you've got time to talk. When they tell you how things have affected them, what you're picking up patterns of resonance of how the heart is stirred. Yeah. And that definitely stuck with me as to, it's not the blood, it's not the guts, it's not the gore that draws people deeper and deeper in. There was something much more subtle and sophisticated at work. And hearing from people and interacting with them, it was an ongoing series of invitations to that type of reflection. So that if you would have said on January 1st, 2023, when I started the book, day one, page one, what will it look like in June? I think I would have given a very different vision of the text. Sure. But as I traveled and as I interacted with students and as I prayed and reflected and worked, it took on a life of its own, but that was a life of its own, really always responsive to questions and horizons of questions that had been open for me through conversation. So I want to take us back to the days before Father Ryan Dunn's. Let's go to young Ryan Dunn's child at home. There's Friday afternoons. You're piling into the car with your dad, with your siblings, and you're heading off to the local video store. Give us the background and the beginnings of your interest in horror movies. I grew up in a very, I think, traditional middle class Catholic parish, Catholic family. The church was across the street from the house. I was an altar server. And I think I was a bit precocious. I was a good student, and I liked Irish music, and I was pretty good at it. And I liked to push the envelope a bit. And so while my peers were interested in one type of movie, perhaps, I always gravitated toward, I would say, a more adult fare, because that has a totally different connotation today. Yeah. But certainly more provocative, mature affairs. And I was fascinated by the darkness, not in a sick, weirdo way, but that there was something about the questions of evil and good, of salvation, of redemption, of the fragility of the body, that early on I was so interested in. One of my earliest memories as a kid was probably a Friday, because I think that's when we did our grocery shopping, as I recall. And I had cut my hand on something, and it had, being a kid, I probably didn't let my mother put antibiotic on it, so it got a little infected. And I remember my dad explained what an infection was with bacteria. And I remember pushing the shopping cart, and I must have been first or second grade, and thinking how the bacteria couldn't be bad. They were just doing what they were supposed to do. It was bad for me, and it was sore and achy, and I was crabby. But I remember being so interested that something painful was actually good for another living organism. And that became part of my, I guess, my social imaginary, the framework through which I saw the world. And those horror movies were, I'll admit, like, silly ways of exploring this. But there was something about them that just, the many and various ways of the dimensions of the darkness that they allowed people to explore. And I thought that was really cool.
It's amazing. It's fascinating. I give a 4-week rotation to medical students called The Wisdom of Literature in a Time of Plague, that came about when a lot of these students were being dislocated from their clinical work because of COVID and so on. So we dove into plague literature and so on. But we have themes each week: duty, suffering, grace, a couple of these themes. And the suffering week is one that speaks kind of acutely to exactly what you're talking about. It's an interesting phenomena that people want to sit on a Friday night and watch a movie where someone else is suffering. I mean, I don't care if it's a plague movie, if it's a horror movie, if it's a drama with, the pursuit of happiness, the terrible things going on to a person. And it's always kind of sort of captivating to me. Is this some sort of a sadistic, voyeuristic type of a tendency, or is there something about, which I think is a little bit more now you can't kind of, again, go down some dark alleys, but there also is something about commiserating with someone else a little bit, kind of, sympathizing, if not empathizing, with somebody on screen. But I also think there's a little bit of something about taking cliff notes. I mean, or reading cliff notes. How is this person going to get out of this pickle? And are there any, consciously or subconsciously, are there any lessons I can learn and apply to what I may face going ahead that may kind of bring me to a better place? Is there any, we're going to talk again more about the theology of horror and so on, and your book is fantastic, unfolding so many of these things. Is there any merit to that notion that I just described?
Oh, I think you're right on there. I'm mindful of Simone Weil, is it On the Right Use of School Studies, at the very end, and she recounts, it's the final paragraphs, I think, of that essay, if not one close adjacent to it, where she recounts the Grail legend of that the location of the Grail is known by a king who masquerades as a beggar, and will reveal the location of the Grail to the passerby who says, "What are you going through?" The person who stops and notices and inquires what that person is suffering, what that person is undergoing. So I think there is something that there's a dynamism or a drive toward recognizing the suffering of another. There's almost it becomes a weird empathic connection that we're driven, that drives us to, I think there's an interest in suffering. What can the other withstand without breaking?
Yeah.
And not every horror movie probes this very well, but certainly, plague literature does, or the apocalyptic type of films. How far can a person be pushed before that person breaks? And can we watch as that person undergoes that suffering and imaginatively either put ourselves in that person's place, so there's a sympathetic resonance that occurs, or we watch it unfolding. And I think there is, to your point, like a Cliff's Notes, a learning from what that person goes through and how do we respond to it. Like the movie Wit, I would teach to any medical resident or would-be doctor. But how do we interact with people? How do we see people as persons and not as object specimens, useful cadavers that still have a pulse? Which that's the tendency. So there's a hominization, humanization that takes place that can take place through these films.
We're going to get into this a little bit further in our next subsequent segments, but this does speak a lot to the dignity of the individual undergoing the suffering in horror movies, in plague movies, and all those kind of things. Because one of the things that I've said to my students a number of times is, after a while, if you watch a plague movie, it's not to say that the terrible things that a plague can do to any individual person that isn't horrible, but the plague becomes monotonous, becomes stereotypic. I risk saying it becomes boring because I don't want to sound like I'm callous. The drama is, what do people do in reaction to it? And so it seems like whenever you're looking at the real dramas we're watching, we're looking at what the monster does and what this horrible things are that are going to befall somebody, but we're kind of trying to wonder, how's this person going to get out of it? How do they react to it? Why is this person strong and this person's weak? Why is this person faithful and that person's a turncoat? The drama is the human condition in response to these terrible things. Again, you elaborate on these things eloquently in this book, but it is fascinating that we're watching ourselves more than we're watching the stuff that happens to ourselves. Is that fair to say?
Oh, I think whether we use the the imagery of the icon or even just a mirror, these I think one reason that these movies tend to be attractive is because they are telling us our story. And what really makes a horror film pop negatively in the Terrifier series, how can we so overwhelm the system? I mean, those movies boggle my mind. Boggle my mind with the level of violence. It's unbelievable. But then there are the films, and I think of something like Hereditary, Oddity. That's more of a contemporary retelling of the Gollum legend. Those films, they push the boundaries in a different way, where it's not gore, but they're revealing something about ourselves that in our day-to-day waking world we are apt to ignore. But as day seeds to night, I think that there are some dark illuminations that result, and these films, when they're well done, enable us to see them. Yeah.
So, Father, I know many people listening are wondering, before we get even further deeper into this great book, Theology of Horror, when did you discern your vocation to the priesthood? Could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Happily. I went to, I'm Jesuit educated from high school all the way through. And in my St. Ignatius High School in Cleveland, I have very fond memories of the Jesuit teachers I had, and being especially moved at watching the entry processional to all school liturgies and the Jesuits and the cast of characters that they were. And as I went through college studies and then a master's degree in religious studies at John Carroll University, I saw more and more that the type of faith that they lived, the types of questions that they asked, the joy that they had for the gospel and for serving others was infectious. And I most appreciated at the time, and I continue to appreciate, the way the Jesuits who taught me almost to a person had a knack for getting under people's defense mechanisms and the fences and the boundaries that get put up. And they, to use the Ignatian language, they knew how to come into our doors and lead us in a process that that showed us other ways were possible. And so I had entertained notions of medical school. I had entertained being a professional Irish musician. Flirted, of course, with law school and business school. Would that fit me?
Yeah.
But the language I use now, I was really attracted to the missionary vocation of the Society of Jesus. And when you look at the formula of the Institute, of the constitutions of the society, there are so many ways Ignatius envisioned that his Jesuits would serve others and help souls, and not just in souls, not just in some ethereal spirit realm, but really help people. How do we help living people to know, love, and serve Jesus Christ? And that imaginative range so appealed to me. Now, I'm old enough and comfortable in my own skin. I'm not a great linguist. I'm good at reading languages. I'm not great with speaking languages other than English and some Spanish. But I realized as a teacher, I had 3 great years teaching high school in Detroit, and I think that's where my Jesuit vocation became most solidified, was teaching high school boys. I was able to reframe my desires as becoming a missionary of the imagination.
Wow.
And to enter the power of the imagination, so underappreciated today. We pornify the imagination. We dismiss the imagination. But our capacity to enkindle new ways of thinking and perceiving the world around us. I think Bishop Barron starts that wonderful, and now I see theology is faith's way of seeing. It's of seeing the world.
Right.
Well, yeah, it's a way of imagining how the world is and could be, and that to be possessed of Jesus's imagination by being confronted with his ministry, by being touched and transformed by his parables. That to me is what my Jesuit teachers did. And so I just would say I knew I could not be a member of the diocesan clergy only because it wasn't missionary enough for me. Yeah. I feel that my missionary boundaries are at the edge of culture, and especially today, where there can be indifference or skepticism about the big claims of Christianity. I think there are ways of getting underneath people's defenses, surprising them, like sitting at an airport bar or teaching a class on the theology of horror that meets people where they're at and takes them and allows them to find a direction they might not have expected, one that's not imposed on them by an external source, but one that's disclosed to them by the Spirit.
This is so important. And I think that, as we all know, there's so many people that are disaffiliated that identify as the NONES nuns that are out there, and they're not going to be walking in, other than maybe as a tourist in a vast European cathedral. They're not going to be walking into a church and knocking on the door of the priest and saying, I have all sorts of questions. I mean, some do, but in most of the time, what has to happen is that we have to be missionaries, as you said, to the culture, but we have to be fluent in the culture. And it sort of goes back to Bishop Barron doing initial movie reviews on The Departed. I mean, here's this very, violent story of kind of, mob kind of activity out in Boston, if I remember correctly. And it's like, where are there glimmers or echoes of God in this narrative here? And so on. And so it just strikes me. That's why I think it's so novel that you're going to the heart of what, many people, including some of my daughters, are getting together with their friends on Friday night and they're popping in a horror movie and so on and so forth. And if you can speak to this and see it through a theological lens, which you do chapter after chapter after chapter, you're evangelizing the culture. You're approaching the ad extra as opposed to the ad intra of our culture. I think it's fantastic.
It's on the forefront of my mind. I'm at Marquette University, and we just had our mission week, and we had a wonderful series. It's been a wonderful, wonderful week. Great speakers. But one of the topics that was raised emphasized hope and healing in a broken world. And I have no disagreement. I am the first to remind our students, sin is a big deal. Very big deal. And because we don't have a language for sin in our culture, we've replaced it with callous surrogates that don't get us very far at all. I love sin as a concept, and it's useful and helpful. But when this notion of the world is broken, what that can very quickly give rise to is a level of hopelessness. And here we are wringing our hands that our students are and our young people are anxious, depressed, and don't see a hope-filled future. Well, of course they don't. All we talk about is how bad things are and the world is broken. What I am more convinced of than ever, it's not the brokenness. We know it's broken. That the world is broken, riven by sin. But there is, through grace, an unbreaking of the world, a repair of the world that is ongoing. And that the healing of the world, the healing of the imagination, we can't, there ain't no app for that. There is no therapy for that. Yeah. This is the work of grace. It's Flannery O'Connor writ large. Yeah. And we need, I like, my Flannery O'Connor did it all. I think the many horror films get a good bit of, they get the violence of Flannery O'Connor, and my job is in a weird way to throw the theological and metaphysical supplement in. Yep. So like those crystals that you drop into the water and then they grow, to help bring out how these narratives can be catalysts for change and help us to rethink some of the fundamental categories of the world, and to start to see the unbreaking of the world that is taking place before our eyes.
I love that notion, the unbreaking of the world. And again, like you said, by acknowledging the grace that outlasts, the brokenness. I mean, that is the Catholic narrative. That is our faith, and we are an Easter people. So it's a great reminder, and also a world that kind of champions nihilism and says, well, if you want to find hope, here's an ideology you can cling to, or here's an identity you can cling to, or what have you. And it's sort of like, well, how about the identity that you're a child of God, and that in the end God wins? So let's look to the grace that penetrates like shafts of light through this darkness. I wanted to ask you, Father, so we talked a little bit about your trips to the video store. We talked about your time at in the airport or the hotel bar and doing your research and so on. And then we talked about your vocation in the priesthood. Specifically, when did you start perceiving the theological underpinnings of some of the most raw horror movies? We're not just saying, you're kind of noticing kind of with the cut on your hand and the role of the bacteria and also your kind of fascination with the horror movies as a child and pushing the envelope. But when did you specifically start to put a sense of or discover a sense of the theological underpinnings of these works?
I think there's a moment I share in the book is the last day of freshman year of high school. That's the day I watched The Song of Bernadette that deeply affected my spiritual imagination, my religious imagination, and The Exorcist with my dad that night. And I think that created a weird bridge that it would take years for me to walk across, but it began to, I think, solidify as a high school teacher. And I started to notice what interests my students had in film. When I was a baby Jesuit, so I entered in 2004, that the Saw movies were coming out, Hostel, and I think they're rightly called torture porn. How much pain can be inflicted on the human body? I don't much fancy those, but my students were interested in types of horror movies, particularly zombies. The Walking Dead came out at 2009, 2010. And I started to, as a teacher, I taught a lot of sophomore boys at U of D Jesuit. And to get the toeholds I needed, I started to figure out, what were you watching? What were you listening to? And I seized onto those, and then not uncritically, but would incorporate them into our lessons to try to create the resonance points for them, and so that they could see that theology just wasn't one more class they had to take, but it was the class that was slowly working to transform how they saw. Yeah. And it seems to, it was popular. They liked it. And then over time, like during my theology studies, it became more and more apparent. The more sophisticated I became as a theologian and a metaphysician, that really crystallized in my mind, like, oh, there are really interesting touch points here. There's a lot of deep philosophical and theological themes that are at work just under the surface, but we're not talking about them because we don't have the way to get under it and excavate it. So that became in the back of my mind what I was working on for a long time.
So, Father, in the opening of the show, I quoted some staggering statistics that come from your book surrounding people's penchant for horror movies. I want to talk about why we've touched on it, but I want to give it a head-on question. So, Dr. Fritz Perls observed that, quote, fear is excitement without the breath, close quote. So I'm going to ask you, again, we've talked about commiseration, cliff notes, and so on, but is there anything else you want to say about what it is about the human condition that possesses a certain delight in horror movies, ghost stories, or the anecdote that sends chills down our spines? I mean, shouldn't we be running from this saying these should be box office bombs, and yet they're just crazy popular? Would you say anything else about what you've discovered about our penchant for the horrible in specifically as it applies to film?
Sure. H.P. Lovecraft has an essay. It's a very long form essay, and he on the nature of cosmic horror and the supernatural in literature. And he has this image at the end of the first part of the sense of something scratching at the outermost rim of the universe, trying to get in. And I am firmly convinced when we think of our own creed, I believe in things visible and invisible, seen and unseen. There is an awareness shared not only among professing Christians, but the great William James, of an unseen order. And horror movies give us the space and the permission to explore that order, to ask the question, what if? Is it possible? And to linger on that. If we are not alone in the universe, itself a staggering question. And are we alone? What does that mean? If there are unseen forces at work, not only in the cosmos, but within our hearts and within our world, it changes the way we behave, and it changes the way we interact with others, the way we perceive others. Are we just meat machines ambling about for a short duration of time and then we die? Or which some horror movies would depict it that way. On the other side, is there something sacred about us, something of inherent human dignity that needs to be preserved and is worth fighting for and resisting the forces of darkness? I think that part of the shock of horror is an awakening that many of us have. It's like hitting rock bottom and saying, this is not how I want to live. The ingress or the inbreaking of the horrifying reveals to us, in some ways, what it is we most desire. It gives us a chance to think about our priorities in life, often in violent ways. But I think that they become sites of the line I used, the words I used, the frag event, a fragmenting event that causes a breakdown of the known world as something unwanted breaks through. It, at the same time of that breakdown, it gives us a chance to think through how things might be otherwise. And I, as I'm sure we'll talk about, I think that's what the gospel is, the anti-horror story in the most compelling way that John Carpenter himself or Tobe Hooper could not have imagined. So it gives you, I just think horror opens up, it's a graced box, like Pandora's box, that you can pull out any theological concept, any psychological concept, and probe it in a fun and compelling way. And especially I always think in terms of a teacher, it engages young people. Like if that's where they're at, and that's how they see the world, think about the world, and are interested in the world, well, then let's use it, and then not as a swamp to stay in one place, but draw them toward the river of deep and vibrant thought and move them along in the process.
Segment 2, The Theology of Horror. In his book, Theology of Horror, Father Ryan Duns writes, quote, "In each film in this book, we visited the site of the dark transcendence eruption into history. Our goal was to forage amid the rubble of the old taxis, or order, for the fragments of metaphysical and theological insight. In the breakdowns of cinematic horror, we sought evidence for saving hope," close quote. Continuing on, Father Duns admitted, quote, "I think the fragments we have recovered can contribute to a metaphysical and theological way of life. Indeed, I think we can learn a great deal about God and salvation by canvassing territory often regarded as godless, by contemplating a genre more often associated with damnation. Horror may be an unlikely locus for a priest to practice his craft, but if this is where my students' imaginations are being nourished, I owe it to them to take this genre seriously," close quote. So, Father, while some may call your work dabbling in the dark, the macabre, the irreligious, if not the anti-religious, others may see your foray into the theology hidden in horror movies as part of the missionary work of the church, finding God in dark corners. So is there anything spiritually dangerous or sinful in watching films with gratuitous violence or supernatural jump scares? Is there a threshold across which one moves from spiritual edification to spiritual peril? And are there any horror movies you simply won't watch?
Oh, I love that. So I'm the
I asked you a lot. Sorry. So I start with the first question. The first question, is there anything spiritually dangerous or sinful in watching films with gratuitous violence or supernatural jump scares?
I think if you are watching it because you are, it can be mixed. It can be mixed. I don't glorify violence at all. Would I rather that my students never watch horror films? In some ways, yeah. I mean, I think there really is a difference between Romero's original Night of the Living Dead and let's be candid, Terrifier 3. Terrifier 3 violates, for me, so this goes back to that last question, the kind of film I would never watch. I watched it because I knew it was a phenomenon, but it was only, I will admit, it was grudging that I watched it. But the films that I'm allergic to, if they kill, I reject killing of children, killing of the elderly, killing of anyone with special needs. Like, so that exploitative, sexual violence really skeeves me out. And so I don't show movies like that. I would never show that to students. And honestly, you can't kill your pets. We don't kill animals. I don't unless killer bears and sharks I get, but just gratuitous killing. I see I take no pleasure. And I feel like the misfit in Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is hard to find. Take pleasure in killing. I think, and maybe it's just because of the way I watch the films, I maintain a critical distance, and I don't look at them I don't approach horror as edifying literature. It really is. I mean, when I say an infernal icon, I use them almost as I want to use horror as the counterexample to the type of world that the gospel proclaims. And it's because I am so committed to the good news of Jesus Christ that I can be more fearless, or I feel more, maybe less stupid, going into these dark areas and surveying the territory, not because they're godless or godforsaken, but because they do a very fine job of concealing the divine among the cadavers. So it's a hard answer. I mean, I don't think 9-year-olds and 10-year-olds should be watching horror films. I also don't think 9-year-olds and 10-year-olds should have electronic devices, because horror is among the least of the problems of what they're going to find online. That's going to warp and stultify their imaginations. But a good horror film, like any good story well told, can invite us to see the world in a different way. And even if we say, like, I don't find that credible or edifying or something that I want to live. I'm of a mind to say, well, it's out there, and people are obviously spending money, and people are spending money to spend 2 hours in the darkness to do that, and they won't go down to church and throw a buck in the communion the collection plate. So it's mission territory. You have to go in somewhere.
Well, and what's interesting about it here is that, it strikes me that your experience, you weren't a theologian when you started watching The Exorcist at 9th grade, and yet you were also formed in a house that was Catholic, that practiced the faith, that you were an altar server. There was a religious imagination that sounds like it was fostered within your family that might have provided proper context to some of this, even though you're a kid, not wondering about context, but you're a kid that is just enjoying the thrill of watching this thing that raises the hair on the back of your neck and so on. I imagine that it's. So when I think part of reading this book, it also makes you realize there are people that may have absolutely no religious formation whatsoever that are going to find their way into these films. And like you said, they could end up in a dark place. Some of them might find themselves scared enough or intrigued enough that they're actually going into the area that raises the imaginative question about, well, is there a God? Is there something outside? This is hellish. This is nihilistic. Is there something good that opposes this? So that, like you said, it awakens some of the feelings. And I'm not saying you're saying, well, the first way to evangelize our children is slap in the DVD player, Faces of Death or something like that. But I'm getting, it seems to me, and maybe you tell me if I'm giving pushback. It's best if you're going to watch these films, don't do the overly gratuitous exploitative types. Secondly, it's best that a person has some fluency in the grander narrative of the Catholic faith, so you understand, where the power exists in good, where grace resides, that suffering stops at the water's edge in the kingdom of God. Ultimately, having those understandings will help to contextualize it a little bit, but not everybody has those understandings. So that's where it's a fascinating conversation, because I know there's going to be people that will listen to this and say, this is evil, dark stuff. Don't ever go near it. And you're saying, but there's a lot of people that are going near it. We need to be able to engage with them about it and say, here's the theology or the God points that you can pull out of them if you're watching it.
Sure. So that's you framed that so well. When this past Tuesday, we screened The Exorcism of Emily Rose. There is one death, and we know that she dies because it's the first thing we learn.
Sure.
Emily Rose dies at the end, and fine. But the movie itself follows it is most productively and fruitfully watched if you imagine yourself as a jurist in the film weighing the evidence. And the real question is, the defense versus the prosecution, which is the more possible? And it's raising questions that every theologian, every believer has to ask. What is the relationship, the porosity between our world and the next? So all of so I coupled the chapter from my book with a passage from J.P. Richter, the 18th century poet and author. The dead Christ proclaims there is no God, which is his nightmare vision of a nihilistic. For Christians, we believe in creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing. All that is as an expression of God's divine love, that we're sustained in our being. All of creation, as I say to the students, even Leatherface, if Leatherface exists, is because God wills Leatherface into existence. On the other hand, Richter gives us a nightmare vision of creatio ad nihilum, creation toward nothing. It's all going to collapse. It's a Ragnarok. The petty deities that inhabit our cosmos, these angels, whatever, what have you, all going to collapse in on itself at some point in the future, and it'll all be over. And I said that changes very much how we see the world and interact with others. But that's sort of the leavening of the film that I feel it's my job to do. To watch these movies and to highlight for the students and for the reader of the book, these are the kinds of questions this movie is raising. And this is why the theological and metaphysical tradition of our church is so important. Now, in the weeks to come, as the book turns toward a more and more explicitly Christocentric direction, they read significant parts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John's Gospels, parts of St. Paul's letters, to give them that theological narrative texture that provides the counter narrative and an alternative vision to the narrative of horror. So again, the horror film itself as an artifact becomes for them an unwitting opening to the divine, and I sort of relish in that. And I know people will look askance and say you should never encourage anyone to watch a horror movie. Okay. I mean, as I had a mother who on campus who accosted me about this, and I just put my hands up. I'm like, but they're watching them. Now, I'm not saying it's good. I'm saying they're watching them. So why don't we evangelize them through what they know and get them to something else? And I can get 80 kids to sign up for a theology class and and show up every week. So let's preach the gospel. We don't glorify the gratuitous, but we almost I'd rather subvert it for the glory of God.
And I think many people do. It's a great point that if you look at the Old Testament, if you look at the Passion of the Christ, I mean, this is our faith has there's awful things that happened in the story from Adam and Eve to to Pentecost. You know, it's striking how many absolutely violent things litter our faith, and yet out of those violent things, you're not celebrating gratuity. You're saying, where's the grace that can be eked out of this darkness? And I think the world says, let's just rest in darkness. It's that nihilistic look. And you're saying, you know, let's be tragedians that said dignity precedes a tragedy, dignity outlives the tragedy. Let's look for the dignity and the grace here.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when we look, I'm a member of the Society of Jesus. I am I'm a companion of Jesus. And in the spiritual exercises, I have knelt with him in the Garden of Gethsemane, and I have watched those tears of blood. I have watched a man pushed to his limits because of his vocation to do the Father's will. I have accompanied him on that road to Calvary, and I have watched the fragility of the flesh torn and tattered out of fidelity to the Father's will. I have watched him fall under the weight of the cross, and I have seen people come out and accompany him. That is bloody. It is messy. It is agonizing. That is, and to me, that's the great horror story of history. That the divine transcendent in our midst is treated worse than anything Art the Clown from Terrifier 1, 2, or 3 could do to a human body. And so my courage comes from the willingness to say to the Lord in prayer, I have a weak shoulder, but if you let me, I will accompany you just a little bit further because I know where you're headed and I will join you. And I see how you are. So the wounds of the body, they are graced, as we see at the end of John's Gospel. But we have to take that seriously. Yeah. We have to take that seriously. And horror does a better job than any other medium I know for pointing out the fragility of the human condition and our mortality. And it also, I will say, as a metaphysician, it gives a great way to talk about, the soul, essay, participation metaphysics, that kids are like, oh, I mean, I had a kid who came up to me the other day and said, Father Duns, I always have to remember, cover your essay. I'm like, yes, you must cover your essay. Because if you don't, you're dead. You'll have nothing to cover. So I figure, if you could do plays on words and they never forget that, I'll take the W.
So, Father, Catholic novelist, you've referenced her. We all love her, is Flannery O'Connor. She's known for her gritty and violent stories. And she once said, quote, when you can assume that your audience holds the same beliefs you do, you can relax and use more normal means of talking to it. When you have to assume that it does not, then you have to make your vision apparent by shock. To the hard of hearing you shout, and for the almost blind you draw large and startling figures, close quote. So, Father, beyond commercial success, are there any producers of horror movies that you know of that intend to send an edifying theological message in their work? Or is it more that regardless of producer's intent, it's simply up to the viewer to draw it out for themselves?
Yeah, I think, for my money, Scott Derrickson is the man. I think he's great. He is so clever. And he is, unless it's changed, he is a believer. And The Exorcism of Emily Rose, I think, is a great film because it's deftly constructed. It plays at the threshold between belief and doubt in a way that is so suggestive. I had dinner with a group of students right after class on Tuesday. They loved the movie. They loved it. It's not violent. It's not gory, but it's provocative of the imagination. So I think he's great. James Wan would be another. He's the Conjuring director. He too is a believer, as I recall. And again, he's picked up on the Warrens, very Catholic, the Exorcists, and I think he does a good job, a little more sensational, but still good, of probing the salience of faith in the world, in our world. Ari Aster, I think, is good. He understands how to create an atmosphere of terror that I appreciate. But let's be, and Monaco, I think is his last name, from The Purge. I think the first two Purges can be watched productively with René Girard in hand. Sure. I know Bishop Barron is a fan of Girard, and I am too. I think he gets something about the psychodynamics of society and culture. But and then you look back to the 80s, like John Carpenter and Wes Craven. Yeah. I think they were very good. On the other side, although I'm not praising the Terrifier movies because they are so gratuitous, but it is interesting if you watch the arc from Terrifier to Terrifier 3, they're becoming more and more religious. Bizarrely religious. Which I was not expecting, and I will now have to see Terrifier 4 when it comes out to see what. I mean, I gotta know.
You gotta know. You got another book coming out. Come on.
I gotta do more horror.
So, Father, a number of terms or phrases populate your book, Theology of Horror. I wonder if you could unpack a few of them for our listeners. So a few of them are taxis, metataxis, fragivent, and dark transcendent. So could you just explain, I mean, you introduce them at the beginning and then they kind of thread their way through the rest of the book. Taxis, metataxis, fragivent, and dark transcendent. Could you just tell us about what these mean and their relevance to your work?
Absolutely. So taxis, like it looks like taxis, but it's just taxis. Taxis is the status quo. It is our sense of the normal. The film critic Robin Wood gave a great definition of the monster, that normality is threatened by the monstrous. So normality, the status quo, the taxis, is threatened by the incursion of what is other to the taxis, something foreign, hostile, that threatens to subvert the order as we know it. Every horror film, to be credible, needs to establish a taxis. And you can go watch the opening scene of a Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's a very bleak taxis, but it certainly establishes one. Every film needs to give a sense of this is normal for the audience. This is normal for these characters. The meta-taxis is the sudden disruption that threatens or totally overturns the taxis. So everything is fine until, it's a fun night with the teenagers, and then those those cello notes of Jaws is John Williams the theme song come in, and you're like, uh-oh, something's happening, and then the metataxis, the midnight swim turns into a gurgle bloodbath. The metataxis is that moment in a horror film when the status quo is overturned and put upside down, and it elicits the response from the characters to resist in some capacity whatever this monstrous incursion is. The word frag event comes from the theologian David Tracy, and Tracy apparently is he's one of the great theologians of the 20th and 21st century who has written the God book that apparently tells us what we're supposed to believe, but it's written on yellow notebook papers and is stacked up in his house. So let's hope it gets published. David Tracy has the idea of he takes the idea of the fragment, and fragment here as noun and verb. Fragment, a particle that fragments, that breaks apart, like the pebble that shatters your windshield. And fragments, every fragment can fragment something else. Well, the frag event is the way if the taxis and metataxis take place in the film, the frag event is sort of what shatters that fourth wall between the viewer and the movie to raise the deeper metaphysical and theological questions that force us and also the characters to question the very nature of the world around them. So you take the Conjuring movie, the Exorcist movie. If your taxis is purely secular, there is no divine, God can't enter the world, God's not even a question. Then there's the metataxis. There are signs and intimations of a presence that is breaking into the world, that is threatening me, my family, and the world as I know it. Well, the frag event is as that metataxis becomes more and more apparent and obvious, it calls into question, it fragments the old world picture that we held, our metaphysical, theological framework, and forces us to redraw it. So, like in class, I'm forever talking about taxis, metataxis. How does this work as a frag event? What kind of questions does it raise for you, the viewer? How does it implicate you in the telling of the story and make you think about the world? Because I think if a movie is successful in terrifying us, and we saw this in The Exorcist in the 70s, it's because it was a frag event. It shattered the way people saw the world and thought, oh, is this possible? So the frag event raises the question of possibility. And I say this, the luminous counter to it is that's what the gospel does. The gospel should hit us as a frag event that says, holy God, is that God? Is this how things could be? And that there's a positive frag event too. Not every breakdown is bad. Yeah. We know that from recovery stories. Sometimes the breakdown is the best possible thing you can have.
And if I could stop you for a second there. So the frag event is that which that's not within the movie. That's extending outside of the movie and affecting the viewer. Am I correct in saying that?
Yes. I think the frag event also affects the characters because it challenges their metaphysical and theological presuppositions, but they're not they're not in the classroom saying, now, what about their essay? What do we talk about?
Yeah.
That's a horror movie I want to see.
Yes,
but
yes. That makes sense.
It would make teaching easier.
And then dark transcendent. To talk about the dark transcendent.
So the dark transcendent is the natural or supernatural force whose arrival catalyzes the metataxis and the frag event. And it's the dark transcendent. Again, I'm trying to work out the opposition between the divine and the supremacy and primacy of God. The dark transcendent, I wanted to hold it as an opposition, but not a directly polar opposition, equal in power, because the dark transcendent is not. It's parasitic.
Yes.
But when we think of horror films, there are natural horror films. Jaws is a natural horror. Texas Chainsaw is a natural horror film. Silence of the Lambs, natural. Conjuring, Insidious, The Exorcist. These are supernatural horror film. In each case, I look at the way I identify or denominate the agent that causes the horror, that breeds the terror, as the dark transcendent, as a cipher to find consistency across horror films. And so wherever the dark transcendent manifests itself, there you have the metataxis. And the dark transcendent can affect, warp, mutate the space and time around the characters in any number of ways. And that's sort of what sets the ethos of horror apart and makes it fun and interesting. But the common denominator is that there is some agent at work that is hostile and threatening to the status quo, whether it's of natural origins or supernatural origins. But it's something that boggles the mind, that doesn't make sense. And that's hence the transcendent. It leaps over the categories. It leaps over our expectations. It doesn't fit the taxis. And it calls into question our concepts and categories, the sufficiency of human reason, by confronting it with something that just boggles the mind.
What's so interesting about this is you've outlined effectively a scaffolding upon which horror movie after horror movie after horror movie subscribes, or a recipe that they use, and yet it never grows old. I mean, I know there's some there. I think if I'm not mistaken, it was Scream, the one movie that basically sort of, if I'm not mistaken, kind of pokes fun at some of the tropes in all these horror movies and so on. But with I think a Scream is also a little bit on the serious side too. But I think there's a certain amount of tongue in cheek about these old canards that are being used again and again and again. But it's interesting that you have highlighted a certain outline of the way this sort of works, and yet as people go to the movies, like we talked about at the beginning, you're whatever $690 million in 4 years spent on horror movies alone. They didn't stop going because they saw a horror movie 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago that subscribed to a similar scaffolding. It's being told in a way that's different, but it subscribes to the same scaffolding, and still it scares the living daylights out of people.
Yeah. There's a formula. Horror films, and that's why horror films are so inexpensive to produce. There's the famous examples of Paranormal Activity and the Blair Witch Project.
Yeah.
Shoestring budget, and then they're astronomically successful. But you could, I know of a film producer through my affiliation with Irish Music and Dance, who will go unnamed, and she's awesome. I just don't want to. So I don't want to drag her in. Yeah. But she was a very successful executive with Blumhouse. Decided that an A24, so like the horror powerhouses right now, she left them because she wanted to produce more positive fare. But to make money, she had to go out and produce a horror film, because you can do them at relatively low budgets, but they sell. Terrifiers is a great case in point. Like that was something on maybe Terrifier 2. I could be wrong. I think I have in mind like it was a $250,000 or $500,000 budget, and it did $80 million in sales. Wow. Terrifier 3 had a $2 million budget, something so wee tiny, and it did better than Joker 2 on opening weekend.
Wow.
I mean, think about that. Like Joaquin Phoenix and Lady Gaga versus Art, the malevolent clown who carries a garbage bag filled with devices to kill people with, and they did better than Joker. I mean, the DC universe versus who knew? Yeah. So,
wow, that's amazing.
The combat of the clowns.
Let's talk about the list of films featured. There's in chapter by chapter. We're not gonna have time to go through all of them, but there's a select few that I've watched, and I want to kind of pick your brain on. So I want people to know, in the Theology of Horror, this book that Father has written, he features chapters on the Blair Witch Project, Insidious, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the Exorcism of Emily Rose, The Purge, I Am Legend, Rosemary's Baby, A Nightmare on Elm Street, The Devil's Doorway, Night of the Living Dead, Candyman, Conjuring, Hellraiser, The Black Phone, and finishes up with The Exorcist. What a list. Now let me start by asking you, Father, how did you arrive at these movies in particular, and did any films end up on the cutting room floor?
Oh, the hardest thing was picking films.
Yeah.
And in some ways they're reflective of my own narrative, and I open each chapter usually with a little anecdote or something that just lets you know, like, it has relevance in my theological imagination and how it got there. One of the metrics, and I wasn't successful all the time, like Exorcism of Emily Rose is such a good film with epistemology or theories of knowledge and how we understand the world, that I had to sacrifice and let it include a 2-hour movie. The Exorcist is pretty long as well. But I try to go with the industry standard 90 minutes because then I can justify showing it in a class.
Yeah.
And students will stay a couple minutes later if it goes over. But I tried to pick films that would allow me to undertake a pilgrimage process, asking the types of questions and unfolding a theory of horror and theology that was coherent and that could build over the course of a text, or in this case, like the course of a class, to make a compelling case. But for every movie I picked, I could imagine 2 others that I would love to include.
Yeah.
And I could do 2 sequels, probably half the length of the book now, because I've got the apparatus in my mind as to how I can make it work. But there are so many. You could do The Witch, Oddity, Midsommar, Hereditary, Heretic, Nosferatu. You could do the classics of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Frankenstein, Dracula. You could, like, the great ones. You could do the Roger Corman films. You could do just zombies. A part of it was, how do you offer enough? I also wanted to cast a wide enough net to say, like, the inclusion of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I wanted to avoid the criticism. Oh, well, you picked all the low hanging fruit exorcism type of films. So they're naturally theological. In a couple cases, I wanted to pick films that were not explicitly theological in orientation. The Blair Witch Project, Chainsaw Massacre, to just sort of not to stick it to people, but to say, like, look, like,
it crosses all genres. Yeah, it crosses. Yeah. Are all examples of the genre, I should say.
Yeah, I want to give a big. I would not say I wrote the Theology of Horror. I say this in the book that the original title for the book was The Dark Transcendent: Metaphysics, Theology, and Horror. But my colleagues at Notre Dame Press didn't think it would sell. So I had to go with.
I'll sure say, when I came across this one, it jumped right off the page. So they gave you good advice. Dark Transcendent would have sold me too, but no, this jumps off.
The cover's good.
Well, it is. You got to see this as a clawing hand, and there's these, 4 scratch marks. It's just, it's terrific. So, Father, let's start with the Blair Witch Project. Now, so there are many fascinating points that you make about this movie. 2 in particular stand out for me. So first, the notion that, quote, the world poses a question that draws the person beyond oneself, self-transcendent, but this outer reaching must be complemented by return to self that gives one knowledge of one's situation. So, close quote. This speaks to the reality of what we learn forms or changes us. So that's one thing I want to have you address. The second is the role of the dark transcendent as an entity that apes God and counters God's promises of wholeness, peace, and integration with disintegration, chaos, and fragmentation. So I know this is I'm giving you a lot of these long wind-up questions, so I apologize. But could you tell us, just for those who are unfamiliar, could you just briefly tell a little bit of the plot of the Blair Witch Project, how the young investigators, what they learn changes them, and then the role of the dark transcendent in this film?
Sure. So the movie The Blair Witch Project was a phenomenon when it came out. Was it 1999? And it's a found footage film, and it sort of kickstarted that genre that Paranormal Activity picks up on Cloverfield, as I think Cloverfield 8. And the idea is there is a legend of this entity that haunts the woods of Burkittsville, Maryland, and it's called the Blair Witch. And there's local lore and legends and terrible events surrounding the story of this entity. And these young filmmakers go out to produce a film about it, to capture it on tape, hence the found footage, because the entirety of this is filmed as though it were them exploring and preparing the documentary.
Yeah.
They go into the woods to find, to look for these sites, these historic sites where terrible atrocities took place, and find themselves lost in the woods, and so forced to camp out, susceptible, vulnerable now to the forces of nature, and as it turns out, to some other entity that clearly sees them but is not seen by them, but nevertheless makes itself known to them. And over the course of the nights, there's a building atmosphere of terror as this malevolent presence is made more and more manifest, at first through sound and then through physical demonstrations, rattling of or shaking of the tents that they're in, the establishment of cairns or funeral markers made of rocks. Eventually, one of the members of the party disappears, and his tongue, I believe it is, and his teeth. I know you're a doctor, so you might be able to tell me better if that's the tongue and I think the molars.
Correct.
And so that's not good for him. And it leads to a climactic moment in the basement of a house. And so throughout, you never see whatever is or may be the Blair Witch, if it is the Blair Witch. And this film particularly raises the question of, is it supernatural or natural? Could it be the local yokels perpetrating a terrible prank and then a murderous prank on these three unsuspecting filmmakers? Or is it possible that there is an entity out there manifesting itself through the sound of children laughing, sticks breaking, tongue extracting, teeth extracting, and then murder? It raises great questions, and it refuses to resolve them, even at the end of the movie. And so there you have the intimation of the dark transcendent becoming more and more explicit as the film goes on, as a malevolent and hostile force. And what you see is the effect it has. The three young people who are, I don't know that I would call them best of friends, but they're friendly friends. There's a communion, a fellowship that, with the introduction of the dark transcendent, begins to fracture and fray that relationship. So my teacher of metaphysics, Father Norris Clark, would say, to be is to be in relation. And that all that is, again, creatio ex nihilo, all that is because it is held in existence. It is intimately related to God. The dark transcendent intervenes in this, and it begins to break apart that relationship that holds the communion of persons together. And then because they do not cover their essay, it eventually takes it from them too. And so it severs their relationship with the sustaining force of all creation and life. So the dark transcendent, it poses a real threat. It makes a real difference in this paracosm of the Blair Witch Project, this narrative world that we're inhabiting. And that is how, when we think through horror films, they do ape, in a dark way, sinister way, the action of God. The God who God creates, evil negates. The divine transcendent is creator and sustainer. The dark transcendent is the agent of negation and annihilation that tears communities apart, that tears bodies apart, that exploits the fragility of the flesh. Now that's what we're paying to see. Yeah. But there's a lesson in there about over the course of any series of horror films, or even one, almost a spiritual discernment of how evil is at work in the world. What does evil do? How does it manifest? Like, you're a physician. You know the common symptoms that help you distinguish strep throat and the flu. They manifest in different ways. Yeah. So it's learning to identify the manifestations and finding the root cause. And so that's one of the, I think, spiritual benefits of horror, is that they can attune us to the ploys and the symptoms of the dark transcendent as they appear in film and in life. I know there was another part of the question you wanted me to
No,
answer,
this is wonderful. And I want to ask you, the Taxis is the normal kind of these kids that are going to make a film and they're just bright and happy and they're going to go out and make this adventure and do this story. The Metaxis is the kind of the advent of the, kind of the scary things that are happening to them, the tent, the voices, the sticks breaking, and so on and so forth. That's disrupting the Taxis, if you will. The Frag event is the sense of horror that's happening as they're lost. Our friend is gone. We found his teeth and tongue. But it's also me as a viewer watching this and saying, oh my gosh, this is terrifying. I mean, I thought this was such a scary story because I never saw it. It was like a classic ghost story. I never saw what I was scared of. So the imagination just gins up because of the intimations of what you're afraid of. Am I correct? That's what I want to make sure I understand. The Taxis, Metaxis, is the Frag event. Is that again their perception of the horror of this all? My perception of this is very unsettling, and maybe this is supernatural. Maybe this is a natural. I want to make sure I understand the Frag event part of it.
Oh, no, I think you capture this better than I do. And the Frag event is for the characters. Oh my goodness, is this Josh's tongue? Are these his teeth? What does this? So their world as they know it, the Frag event almost confirms that the Metaxis that has been breaking in upon them, like the again, like if you think of your car windshield, the spider web of a fracturing, boom, it's broken. Yeah. And then for the viewers, like, so I think we're caught up in the Frag event because that moment of finding the tongue and teeth to the very end of the film moves fairly quickly. But for the viewer, in my estimation, the Frag event that begins with tongue and teeth climaxes, and then it almost goes into stasis, like a pernicious stasis at the very end when you see a character facing the corner and you remember, the narrative of what that means, and the camera drops. Yeah. So there the Frag event is what just happened. And so that desire to know, Aristotle begins the metaphysics. All men desire to know. Karl Rahner starts his doctoral dissertation, Man fragt, man questions. We raise questions and we go out in pursuit of answers. Our lives are responses to the questions the world poses to us, and the way we make sense of it and integrate our experiences into a great story. And, like Jesus, come and see. There's the invitation, like the question, like, come see with me, journey with me. Right? This is the question of your life. I want to know, who is this person? And the great frustration at the end of the Blair Witch Project is that our desire to know a stake is driven through the heart. I mean, but it doesn't kill it. You just we can't know. There's no knowing where this goes. And that's the Frag event, the thing we most ache to have. We are denied.
And it's something that you're also driving home the point that part of the arrival at the Frag event is when your rationalization of trying to maintain the illusion of the order falls away. I mean, it's like, I just got, like you said, I just got struck on my windshield with a rock here. I mean, maybe this is just, animals out there making noises. Maybe this is just, I can explain this. I'm going to hold near and dear and hard and fast to the Taxis, to the orderly of things. That's how I stay calm. That's how I don't panic. We'll find our way out. The compass will work. I know what I'm doing. We know what we're doing. And then the Frag event says, no, you don't. This is the undeniable evidence that things have gone horribly wrong. The Metaxis is here. The Taxis is no longer. Is that correct?
Absolutely. We, as humans, do our darndest to maintain the world within the parameters of our reason and our concepts. Yeah. And if it doesn't fit into our framework, well, it doesn't count. It can't. It just doesn't work. And the Frag event says, you know what? The way you see the world is too narrow. You've got it. And what horror does is it bludgeons and batters that framework into submission, and it breaks us open. And I don't think it's necessary. I don't celebrate that, But the process of the frag event is at the heart of every spiritual and scientific discovery, where the way we saw the world, the status quo, the way things ought to work, and whether you're a medical doctor or a scientist or a teacher or researcher, when you start to notice and say, oh, wait a minute, this doesn't fit. There's something a bit wonky about all of these events, and it's not fitting quite into my framework. And try as I might, I can't turn it to accommodate all the evidence. The frag event is when we sort of relax, let the framework burst in on itself, and we start to build out again to accommodate a bigger, wider, richer picture. And we see the world anew.
That's such a great way of putting it, though, because one does have to recognize that it's a rocking of the foundations, but you can have a rocking of foundations, like you said, on the positive side. At some point, and I love this because Bishop Barron talks about this in his Catholicism series, at some point the disciples were amazed and afraid. They realized the enormity of what's going on here. This is something that they could have, well, maybe this, maybe what he did was that, maybe this could explain this, et cetera, et cetera. But when they absolutely apprehended the massive scale of upending their world with miracles and so on, it is both shocking and frightening. But in this case, it's the Messiah. And so it's a great thing. But I love the notion that spiritual and scientific discoveries are basically rooted in a frag event that basically upends the order for good. And like you said, the horror movies are doing it kind of the mirror image of that for bad. But it can awaken us to the notion that this phenomena can be for the good, in the proper context.
And one of the things you could, if you want to dab a bit of chrism on a lot of horror films, you could say many of them are conversion stories. Now, the conversion comes right before they are cleaved. Right. But there is a moment of, and now I see. Yeah. And now I see how this is. We think back to, we just had the reading of the Gerasene demoniac in the daily readings. Why were people so upset that Jesus healed this man? Like, don't you think it would be great? Because that demoniac was part of the taxis. This is how we make sense of our world. He's over there. We're over here. We do our things. He does his demonic things. And then Jesus heals him. That throws off our sense of ourselves. So, who are we without him over there? The outsider suddenly can become the insider again. The man with the withered hand in Mark 3. They're the frag event of stretch out your hand. The breakdown of watching a man called from the margins of the temple to the center of the temple. And in that encounter with Jesus being restored to to human integrity. Respected. He wasn't made different. He was made whole. But that whole making, that terrifies people and it enrages them. Who are you? Who are you to do this? You're throwing off our mojo, man. This is the way we've organized the world. Jesus is he's crucified because he is a threat to sin's status quo. He is the frag event made flesh, wherever he goes. And people, where people see it.
That's amazing. I want to ask so many other more questions. I want to be very sensitive to your time. But before we move to our last segment, I wanted to move to one of my childhood favorites, A Nightmare on Elm Street. In your analysis of this film, you juxtaposed the scarred, finger knife wielding Freddy Krueger with the illuminating and embracing Christ, something something you call, in contrast, infernal disfiguration versus iconic Christification. And so in so doing, you use the opening words of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and you counter that with the opening dark, sweaty boiler room scene where Freddy is fashioning his finger knives. I mean, down to the point even where he says, "Yeah," and he kind of opens those knives and they shing off, with the opening of them. I remember that. That was terrifying. So, unlike the ingress of the dark transcendent that threatens annihilation, you write, the inbreaking of God's word offers hope for divine recreation. So tell us, Father, about A Nightmare on Elm Street and just the lessons you learned.
That is such a classic film. And I know I watched it Because there was no nudity in it, that my parents were fine with us. My brother and me watching it, we were probably 11 and 9, 10, or 12 and 10, something along those lines. But here you have teenagers at their own uncertain period of life, high school, adolescence. And there's the tensions with the parents who are deeply, deeply flawed characters. And we see the way that the original and originating sin of the parents is passed down and affects the children. Like there's intergenerational trauma, if we want to use that phrase. But where you have Freddy Krueger invading the most vulnerable place. We think of sleep. John of Dreams comes to ravel up the sleeve of care and knit us back to wholeness. And there, where we should be most safe and secure, this scarred, disfigured remnant of the past comes and wreaks havoc and revenge on the children of his persecutors and murderers. And so he enters through the darkness and perpetuates darkness, and uses violence to do so. It's not violence that seeks justice. It's violence for the sake of violence and death and carnage and to sell tickets. But again, and maybe this is my Ignatian spirituality, as I accompany Jesus through prayer, especially the life and ministry, that's the opposite. Jesus enters people's darkness, the worst moments of people's lives, the death of a child, the sickness of the hemorrhagic woman or a leper or a paralytic, the death of a friend Lazarus. He enters grief and trauma not as one, he's not colonizing people's experiences, but the Word of God made flesh, the author of life, brings life and returns life to those he encounters. So I think that's just the negative contrast between horror and the gospel, where Jesus shows he is the avatar of the kingdom of God. This is the way. This is Jesus is forever revealing the taxis of the kingdom. This is how the Father desires the world to be.
It's beautiful.
Freddy Krueger, on the other hand, is the metataxis of the dark transcendent. This is how the world is going to be sundered and sullied. They're mere images. And that's why, so I use the language of infernal icon. When we stare at Freddy Krueger, the infernal icon, we are reached by him, or the characters are reached by him, and it's destructive. Whereas to gaze at the face of the Lord is to be made whole again. And we can think of so many people who pray, Lord, make me different. Make me different. I'm not as you want me to be. And there can be that too. But even the man with the withered hand, he makes him whole.
Yeah.
He makes him, and I think, I don't know, this is my pastoral teacher side. So many young people today, so many of my own students, I can only speak for that, the students I work with, the people I've sat at the bar with, that is something, to your line earlier, that is both astonishing and terrifying. Mm-hmm. That the Lord can make you whole. Yeah. Because we don't even know what that's like, that you can be loved and accepted, made whole, and that's going to change your life forever. It'll convert your vision and values in a way that leads you in a new direction of life. But it's always as a response to his initiative to reach out, his initiative to call. So it's two forms of initiative. Freddy's initiative, devastation. Jesus' initiative, it's divine illumination and transformation. And that's why I like to juxtapose the two of them, because you can look at, if we want to take a more Thomistic view, a general characteristic effect. What is the action of the agent on the patients around? Well, Freddy Krueger, it's death and devastation. In Jesus, it's the exact opposite. It's hope. Despair versus hope, love versus carnage. But but I think it's worthwhile reflecting on that. And that's, by this point in the semester and certainly the book, the language is there to allow people to do that. And you can kind of say, oh, I see how Freddy works. And that helps us to appreciate more the radicality of Jesus's mission and ministry.
So much of what I learned from you in reading this book is there's a lot of, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. I mean, there's watching a film wanting resolution almost from the beginning. I mean, knowing we're going to go into this abyss of darkness, but wanting some form of resolution, you wanting some main character to get through to the other side of it, knowing that you're paying money for this harrowing experience you're going to go through. But it's almost like, you're in the midst of this darkness, or there's illumination of light, so you can see the silhouette of what you want in the midst of all if you understand what I'm saying, that it's you're always longing for the good in the midst of this darkness. You're longing to return home when you're far away from there. You're longing to be calm and no longer terrified. So it strikes me that these films, although we willingly walk into this upending of things, we long to return to the right ordering of things, or the improvement of the order. We long for a good frag event that comes out of it, as opposed to a nihilistic or empty one. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. One of my presuppositions is that if you scratch beneath the surface of these films, you can expose not only the director, not only the producer, but the audience's metaphysical and theological presuppositions. In order for the horror film to work, it has to establish that a relationship between the world of the character and the world of the audience. And that world is suffused with metaphysical and theological importance. And in the breakdown of the character's world, the audience also recognizes a breakdown within their own world, or the potential or threatened breakdown in their world. And that's part of that's what's provocative. It's saying it hits trigger points, neuralgia points. Mm-hmm. Doug Cowan calls them sociophobics, but take one of the hints in I know we're going to talk about The Exorcist, but what if our religious tradition is ineffective against the forces of evil and darkness? In the movie Buffy the Vampire Slayer, they play on that. Buffy holds up a cross to the vampire, and he does the "oh please" and sets it on fire, and then she uses hairspray to set him on fire, which was funny on its own. But the sociophobic is, what if our religion is not capable of doing combat with the evil? I mean, I tell the students all the time, I'm like, you go ahead, you go and play with your Ouija board, and when you open the gateway to hell, do not come calling me. You want to go play with the forces of darkness, you go call your local Protestant minister and see where that gets you. And then you're going to be at my doorstep, and I will not help you. I will tell you, go to hell. And I will mean it, because you opened the doorway. So don't play with the Ouija board. Yeah. They find this to be funny. But they're the sociophobics. Like things that I think culturally assume will help us, our religion, our faith, a splash of holy water. I think even some of the horror films can suggest, like, what if that doesn't work? But even in suggesting that they don't work, they're tipping their hat to the fact that there's a belief that they do work.
Yes.
So religion can be everywhere in these films and nowhere at the same time.
Hi, I'm Tod Worner, Managing Editor of Evangelization Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3, the greatest theological horror movie ever made. In The Exorcist, Father Lancaster Marin, the seasoned but solitary priest summoned to perform an exorcism on the tormented child Regan, confesses, quote, "I think the point is to make us despair, to see ourselves as animal and ugly, to reject the possibility that God could love us," close quote. In his book, Theology of Horror, Father Ryan Dunns admits, quote, "It seems fitting to conclude this book with The Exorcist. 50 years after its release, it continues to be lauded as one of the great, if not the greatest, horror films of all time," close quote. So, Father Ryan, let me just begin by asking, why is that the case? Why is The Exorcist considered to be, if not one of the greats, the greatest of all time?
I think there's no film that better raises the perennial questions of the role of the visible and the invisible, the conflict between good and evil, the senselessness and wantonness and destructiveness of the forces of evil, targeting a child who, near as we can tell, has done nothing. An innocent child, not much younger, I imagine, than the Blessed Mother when she received the angel Gabriel as a visitor. At the cusp of a life in a privileged house. Mom is not perfect, but that's life. Mm-hmm. It raises the question of doubt, of belief, of fidelity, of perseverance. Lancaster Barron, yes, they're Jesuits, and I know deep down that entered my psyche as a kid and gave me greater appreciation for my own Jesuit teachers. Not that they were exorcists. They were worse. They had to deal with high school boys. But I think it touches on everything. And at the end of the day, it's a hopeful story. It doesn't deny or gloss over the way evil degrades and is corrosive. And I think if as I get older, I am more appreciative of the way it shows the hideous face of evil. And that evil is not glamorous. It is not seductive. It is not sexy. It degrades and it causes the decay of the human, that whatever it touches is lessened, that the allure of evil is only spurious because what it promises isn't gold, but just disintegration. And at the end of self-serving sacrifice, of self-giving sacrifice, with Damien Care, who offers his life for that of another. He lays down his life for the child. And in one great moment of heroism, casts the demon out. Yeah. So I think it touches so many nerves, and it does so in a religiously informed way. It is not kooky, over the top, and the music is awesome, and it just gets under your skin. So I think the closest relative it has, maybe The Witch, but Hereditary. Hereditary does a really good job too of using music and the darkness and grittiness of the tale, the story, and the shots to sort of get under your skin and get into your bones. And the Exorcist still does that for me. It gets in my bones.
Father, just because some people have been too scared to watch it because they've heard enough. And by the way, I want to relay a story. When I was a kid, my mom and dad, I was 4th grade, 5th grade. My mom and dad decided to watch The Exorcist, but there's like, this is too scary, so you need to go. It's time for you to go to bed. And so they sent me to my room down the hallway, pulled the shade down. I'm lying in this room by myself in the dark, listening to The Exorcist. Okay. Worst idea ever, Mom and Dad. So just wanted to say that. It's terrifying. And I've obviously seen it since. You've alluded to it a little bit. Just tell people a little bit of what's the premise of the story. And then, by the way, is this based on a true story? Is that the case?
So it is based on a true story. And I have here in my desk a copy of the case file somewhere. It's somewhere in here, or maybe it's in my office. It is. So the story itself, it was not a young woman. In the film, it's a young girl, Reagan McNeil, who, through playing with a Ouija board, obviously the gateway to the devil, Parker Brothers or Hasbro makes light of it, but no, it's a problem. So she is with her mother at Georgetown, in the Washington, D.C. area, where her mother is filming. Her mother, Chris McNeil, is filming a movie. She's an actress on Georgetown's campus. And as it turns out, Reagan is targeted by demonic possession. And so the taxis of the film is interesting because in one way it opens with a quasi-meta-taxis with Father Lancaster Marin, this elderly Jesuit priest who is an archaeologist on a dig, who has so you get the intimation that he is involved in some type of spiritual warfare when an artifact of this demon Pazuzu is uncovered. And then at the end of the opening sequence, you get Lancaster Marin facing down this demon. It cuts to Washington, D.C. The taxis opens. It's this mother making a living as an actress, a successful actress, and caring for her daughter, who is lovely and loving. And then we watch as this invading spirit corrupts from the inside out, not only Reagan's body, but Chris McNeil's household and those attached to her. So it's the malignancy of evil, and it's like a metastatic evil that it flows forward, and it corrupts and destroys everything it touches. In addition to Father Lancaster Marin, there's Father Damien Karras, who is a Harvard-educated psychiatrist, also a Jesuit priest, who is undergoing his own spiritual struggles with doubt in in a vocational crisis. And he is very reluctantly pulled into the case of Reagan McNeil, and only grudgingly, very grudgingly, sees fit to advocate for an exorcism. And then Lancaster Marin comes in at the end, this heroic old priest, to lead the charge against the forces of evil. And the standard phrases that we know here, like the power of Christ compels you, which is in memes and movies. But it is the way. What I love about that film is the way they portray Pazuzu, the devil, as the father of lies, and the way it manipulates and distorts and confuses those with whom it interacts. Is I think that is how evil operates. It's if evil were obvious and apparent, it would be easy for all of us to deal with. But the father of lies gets in and corrupts and corrodes, and does so by confusing us and lying to us. And that's what, so Damien at the end, not unlike Damien of Molokai, who his ministry among the lepers left him himself a leper. So too does Damien Karras, the skeptic, go and minister to the afflicted and becomes himself the afflicted. So there's something beautiful about that. It's something very real about the risk of faith.
There's the couple scenes, and I just this is my favorite chapter of the whole book is on the Exorcist. The whole book is terrific, but there's a particular exchange between Father Damien Karras, again, like you said, a young Jesuit priest psychiatrist. He's got this crisis of faith, and then you have the seasoned, more taciturn archaeologist, exorcist, priest, Father Lancaster Marin. And one of the scenes you describe, upon first arriving at the Georgetown home, Father Marin hears the demon bellowing his name from upstairs. He immediately asks Father Karras to collect the religious accoutrements necessary for exorcism. Karras demurs, saying, "Do you want to hear the background of the case?" And to which Father Marin simply responds, "Why?" And you've already talked about a little bit about the father of lies, but tell us a little. That's such a wonderful. You have this, and this is a little bit of. I was going to ask you another question about the scientism. There's a scientism in the world's reaction. Well, we've got this. Let's do some scans. Let's get some medicines. Let's talk to the psychiatrist. Let's do. We kind of ultimately the system kind of ultimately says, well, we got nothing. We can't explain this, but it's all probably just some figment of her imagination or whatever the case may be. It kind of ends by default in the hands of the exorcist, if you will, or the priest and so on, as opposed to sort of beginning there because it was so odd to begin with. So I love the fact that the guy struggling with his faith, Father Karras, is sort of like, well, don't we need to do kind of a case report and all this? He kind of goes clinical, and the real believer and who's confronted evil, the spiritual warrior, Father Marin, kind of says, you're on the wrong path. Why are you even talking to me about this stuff? It's something beyond that. What did Father Marin then say to Father Karras when Father Karras returns with the accoutrements? What does he say about Satan and the devil basically being the father of lies? Could you just say that a little more on that?
Sure. It's a quote that Marin knows the foe. He knows this is not, it comes in any number of guises, but he knows the one he is about to face.
Yeah.
So he doesn't need, in this particular manifestation or that particular case, there's a topology here. And Marin has the wisdom to recognize it. And this is the goal of spiritual discernment. A good spiritual director, a humble spiritual director, has the capacity, no matter who is in front of him or her, sort of to know well the signs and symptoms, to read and interpret the meaning. He doesn't need the case analysis. He's already convinced, and he knows his ancient foe. And this is what the line he uses, which I just love this. So Marin admonishes Damien. So he puts a check on Damien, the scientist, Damien, the clinician. We may ask what is relevant, but anything beyond that is dangerous. He is a liar. The demon is a liar. He will lie to confuse us, but he will also mix lies with the truth to attack us. The attack is psychological, Damien, and powerful. So don't listen. Remember that. Do not listen. I would add, if I had to go back, and personal. It's not just psychological as in a theory of the mind, a theory of the emotion. It is personal. And it targets Damien at his most sensitive part, the most vulnerable, secret part of his heart. And I would say to any of our listeners today, if you want to know where the devil is at work, or the enemy of our humanity is at work, it's in the most vulnerable and secret places in our hearts and lives, the places we rubble over and conceal and we tamp down and hide. That is the exact entry point, because it's the place where we're rawest and most in a way flawed. That's going to be the part that we think we're hiding from the world, but the one who does not abide the rules of the world targets that, and that's where Damien undergoes his most harrowing of conflicts, because it's, did you really love your mother enough to care for her?
Yeah.
What we talk about, low blows, like you left your mother to die. Because the intimation is, you, Jesuit, very clever boy, you've gone off and gotten all these degrees, you've had all these experiences. Look at how rich you could be. And that comes from his uncle. Like he knows this is in the air. You could have been something. You should have done something more. And then she dies, and here you have the hammer blow of, she's here. Not only could you not save her in that world, but we have her here with us.
Yeah. Oh,
yeah. Your ministry, your practice has failed her. Your faith has failed her.
This is a movie that again, as a child, when I was younger and watched the full film, I was transfixed by the horrible manifestations, head spinning all the way around, levitation, projectile vomiting. But the older I've gotten, and especially with the help of the chapter that you've written, it's just the deeper theological strains that absolutely come leaping out of this. And especially, I know this seems like I don't know if this is a spoiler, but you know what, guys, this movie's been out since 73, so deal with it. But what you describe, what I love is when Father Karras and Father Barron are in the process of exorcising the demon, the child's body's levitating. They're saying the power of Christ compels you. The power of Christ compels you. The notion of it seeming not to work, but that was not that, like you've made mention something about, and I'll let you explain it. Who was the ultimate person being compelled, and in what way were they compelled by this insistent cry, the power of Christ compels you?
Yeah. That has been, I go on this, I think about this all the time. Who is compelled in this movie? Is it Damien compelling the demon? No, the power of Christ that compels is Damien is the one who is implicated in this process. Like, and the more I think about it, the more you realize the exorcism is of his own faithlessness, his own doubt, that he becomes the a Christ figure. He becomes the priest he was ordained to be, who lays down his life for a friend or for another. In this, I wouldn't call them friends, but it is he who is compelled and convicted by that power of Christ. To take on the burden of the other. And therein is the salvation and redemption of Reagan by that intervention. So he has entered the chaos of her life and delivered her from it. And isn't that, and I think when we think of hokey depictions of exorcism, make it seem like it's the striving power of the exorcist versus the power of darkness, when in fact it is the power of the exorcist. Power comes from the person of Jesus Christ and God the Father through the Holy Spirit that you serve. It's not pitting the human versus the divine. It is allowing the exorcist to be a sacrament of the divine at work in the world. And that line, God writes straight with crooked lines. What we see in a way is the straightening of Damien, of finally finding that, of allowing himself to be the conduit he has been ordained to become. And so the power of Christ that compels him to do the thing that only Christ can do. And so the movie rightly refocuses our attention that the initiative of grace is always as a gift of God. It is not at it's not at the power of the exorcist. It's not something they wield. It's not magic. It's ministry, and it's ministry in persona Christi. Is the power of Christ that compels him to become the Christ, that persona.
Again, how often are we surprised by God? This is an example of a story that, we're expecting one thing. Okay, they hold the cross out, they say these things, the child rests, and that's all there is to it. And instead, the story is much, much deeper than that, with a good outcome for the child. But like you said, it's the ultimate martyrdom, assuming in persona Christi, that for Father Karras. It's an extraordinary. It never really totally dawned on me until I read that chapter as you unfolded it. It's just a brilliant, brilliant testimony, faith-filled testimony. Father, I will get in trouble with my daughter if I don't ask you this. I'm not trying to switch gears. I got just a couple questions left. I have to ask you. Vivian asked me to ask you, my 10th grader. She said, if you had to convince all of us who are listening to you to watch one horror movie, and it can't be The Exorcist because we focused so much on that and called it perhaps the greatest ever, what would that horror movie be and why?
So it's the penultimate chapter. I would have people read I would watch The Black Phone. Okay. The Black Phone is written by Joseph Hill. Joseph Hill is the son of Stephen King. So a love of the macabre seems to run in this family. And it's a great story. The short story is very short. The movie, I think, with the exception of one jump scare, is not bloody. it's disturbing. It's disturbing. But what I love about this movie is that I think it teaches us a great deal about prayer, about what it means really to pray. And I've said this, I say it in the book, I'd say it to the listener as a goad to see the movie. It's on, I think it's still on Amazon, so you could stream it for free. Before the movie starts, God writes straight with crooked lines, and go and repeat that line at the end of the movie. God writes straight with crooked lines. And the movie takes on a totally different tenor when we see how the supernatural is at work in the world, not in spectacular, all or nothing ways, but piece by piece, to the discerning, prayerful eye, you see the way divine providence has been revealed in and through history. And it doesn't show up under the label divine providence.
Right.
But in looking back, you say, oh, I see how in the lives and acts of others, history has been moved along. You know, I think to wax theological in two directions. One, I would just say, you know, Mary, like the Blessed Mother, did not just pop out. Like it was like, oh, here she is. She is herself the product of an infinity of yeses said before her. She is herself in the line of the human family. She is herself the openness of humanity to divinity. And it just didn't happen. There's a history of her people. And that I think we should never lose of how Mary shows us what humanity looks like at its best.
Yeah.
And then I would say, if you're looking for something to read, there's a lovely, I think the most beautiful piece of prayer writing I've ever read is the first chapter to Karl Rahner's The Need and Blessing of Prayer. And he is a young priest. He's maybe 38 years old, giving a series of lectures to people who have lived through the bombing of their towns. And the image he uses is having to take refuge in the basements of their homes. And so it's the rubbled over heart. So as they hid in the cellar and the upper houses collapsed down on them, people could be trapped in their cellars for days. But he uses that as, I think, a still pressing example nearly 100 years later of the spiritual condition, that we're trapped in these rubbled over hearts, isolated, we feel trapped. And he has this wonderful way of saying, you know, there in the human heart, you repeat your illusion-free philosophy of life, and you clamor and scream until you realize that you've never been alone after all, and that he has been with you the entire time, loving you and listening to you and strengthening you. And so so what the Black Phone does on a cinematic level, and what Rahner does in the level of spiritual literature, is get you back into that most intimate, universal source of strength, hope, faith, and love that abides within each one of us, within the rubbled over hearts. And he, like Rahner, like my Jesuit teachers, had a knack for using an image to get under your defenses, the rubbled over heart, and helping to explore what's going on in there. So I always say, at the end of the day, Karl Rahner will always be my favorite theologian because he taught me how to pray. He gave me the courage to admit the rubbled over heart. And the imagery of the Black Phone very much parallels the image of the rubbled over heart and the need to receive that call of the one who loves you, and how that gets revealed. So I think that movie it's top notch.
Fantastic. Two last questions, Father. First, how has your book, Theology of Horror, been received by your contemporaries and your students?
So I'm waiting for the first reviews to come out. It came out in October, so it's, and as you know, with the publishing world, it takes a little while to get that out. So if you like it, you can put it up on Amazon. People buy into the Amazon reviews. I know a good friend of mine, and if you've not met him, Stephen Nepper, who teaches at VMI. If you need a guest on your show, yes, Stephen is amazing. Stephen is the best. The best. English literature, wrote a book on William Desmond, Byung-Chul Han, he just co-authored a book on. He's an editor. Stephen is top drawer.
Great.
Just the best of us. He wrote an article. He wrote a review for Commonweal that will come out, and it was received. He really enjoyed it. The students seem to like the book a great deal. They find it pretty readable. It's not easy. I think if I could write a follow-up book, I would try to make it a little bit more popular. It is a work of scholarship. I try to make it as accessible as possible. I wrote it with an undergraduate reading every chapter. Clever kid, but he did. But I had a research leave, and I'd like to be a full professor someday. So I did have to write a book that would get me there.
Yeah.
And I hope it does that. So, but it has sold well. It's selling well for an academic book. And yeah, the early reviews have been strong. Anecdotally, people coming back to me to say that they enjoyed reading it. So there's hope. There's theology and horror. There's the horror and religion. But this, I think, is the first theology of horror.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to say that I don't claim that I'm the founder of a movement. I don't think that's the case. But it was a privilege to have the semester to think about these things, and then produce something that may get people who wouldn't otherwise think about theology to think about theology.
I want to commend this to so many of our listeners because, first of all, it's a wild ride with with the unfolding of these films, a number of which many of you will have seen out there. But it has that theological tint appropriately, a theological lens through which to look at these that almost makes one feel a little bit like reading The Habit of Being at the same time as you're reading Wise Blood, from Flannery O'Connor, that you have the rawness of her stories, her short stories as well as her novels, but then you have The Habit of Being that unfolds or unpacks some of the theological rootedness or the lens through which she kind of looked at some of her works and explains certain things. And again, I think one of the things Flannery O'Connor said so well, she said, I tell a story because a statement would be inadequate. And so this theology is housed in the story of these horror movies, and it's very engaging. It does challenge you to kind of understand and grapple with the some of the philosophical and theological terminology and so on. But you explain that very, very well. It's very approachable. Highly, highly recommended for people to read this. The Theology of Horror: The Hidden Depths of Popular Films. I want to close with one final question, Father. In researching these films and considering the theology that has emerged out of them, how have you personally been changed?
I'm a better viewer, and I think I'm a better receiver of stories. And I am more and more convinced as I teach and work with our students. The biggest impediment to the sharing of the gospel is that our students, many of us, are not good storytellers, and we're not good story hearers. We want things summarized in a 30-second TikTok.
Yeah.
And it takes patience to sit through a film. It takes patience to read a story. It takes patience to listen to a story. And I'm growing more and more convicted that the future for our church and our ministry as missionaries is going to be learning to tell the story of Christianity in compelling ways, faithful ways, credible ways. But we also have to empower people to receive and share those stories too. And getting students to talk to each other, and I'm in the middle of proposing a grant, the core of which is training young adults and high school students especially in a practice of Ignatian conversation based on story. So how do we exchange those narratives and then reflect on the types of stories that resonate and move our hearts to action? So how have I been changed? I am more, we are not, I am all for, again, I love a good argument. I love a good essay. no one converts for a logical proof. They convert because through a conversation, they say, I find myself in this story. This is my story.
Yeah.
My heart is burning within me. Oh, this makes better sense of my life. I need to learn more. Let me come and see.
Yeah.
And so that's the power of story. We have to, I do worry when people think that stories are fuzzy or sentimental. They're not. We are storytelling animals. We live the story of the gospel and for every one of our lives, every one of us who professes the creed, confesses the creed, that's a story that needs to be told and received and retold again and again and again. So we are, each of us, a living narrative rooted in something else, and we have to learn how to share that and how to find those narratives, even in some unorthodox and unexpected places, like horror films.
Father Ryan Duns, priest, professor, and theologian of the horror movie. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you, Todd. This has been absolutely a blast.
So I've been thinking, when I was younger, I couldn't get enough of horror movies. As a fifth grader, I remember driving by the movie theater marquee in Mason City, Iowa, on the opening weekend of A Nightmare on Elm Street and being transfixed by the spooky stories my older sister told me about the movie. As a teenager, I recall going to a family friend's house and renting Friday the 13th Part 2, knowing full well that my parents would never allow it, but they were too distracted with their adult friends at the time. And I remember lying alone in a dark room listening to the guttural screams of a possessed Linda Blair in The Exorcist, while my parents down the hallway contented themselves that I was too young to watch the film, but apparently not too young to listen to it in the darkness. There's always been something fascinating about horror movies. But until I met Father Ryan Duns, I never knew there could be a theology behind them. Father Duns makes a point that even though we might not like that so many people are watching horror movies, it doesn't change the fact that they are, in fact, watching them. And so Father Duns decided to do what Christ did. He meets them where they are. Now, Father Duns offers this disclaimer. Films awash in gratuitous violence, sexual violence, and violence against children, the elderly, and those with special needs are bridges too far for him to watch. But that hasn't stopped him from watching and analyzing the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the Black Phone, the Purge, and the Night of the Living Dead. Evil is a parasite, C.S. Lewis instructs, not an original thing. It is a privation of the good that still needs to use the true, the good, and the beautiful as bait to draw people into its clutches. And so in horror movies, we see bad things befall good people, and we lament the tragedy because something good was lost and something good will be remembered. Evil hates that it depends on an element of good for its existence and efficacy. Instead, evil wishes for eternal pain and abject nothingness. And that is why, as Catholics, we are tragedians, acknowledging ineradicable dignity, notwithstanding loss, and we are not nihilists who believe that there was never any dignity to begin with. In his book, Theology of Horror, Father Ryan Duns instructs us to watch horror movies with Catholic eyes and even engage our kids or our friends about the film's theological and philosophical undertones that resonate within us unawares. If people are watching horror movies, then perhaps it is Catholic mission territory to meet them where they are. Just be sure to bring God along with you. And one last thing. To be sure, read Father Ryan Duns' Theology of Horror for a thoughtful consideration of the theological themes to be discovered in the movies that make us jump. But I would also encourage you to watch some Alfred Hitchcock films. Among my favorites are Rope, Dial M for Murder, and Rear Window. And ask yourself where you see intimations of God in the struggling characters and the vexing trials in which they find themselves. You can't divorce God from the human narrative, so be sure to look for him in unlikely places. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization Culture Podcast. I'm Tod Worner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.